Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our next EV5 webinar with FPP and Latitude Worlds. Joining us today are three very experienced professionals in the investment migration space who will give us valuable perspectives not only on investment migration, but also on the EV5 process as a whole. We are joined today, first and foremost, by our guest, Chris Willis, who is the co-founder and managing partner of Latitude Group. Chris Willis is the co-founder and managing partner for the Americas and Caribbean at the Latitude Group. With nearly 30 years of experience in investment migration, he's a recognized industry expert, government advisor, and frequent international speaker. Chris is a fellow at the Investment Migration Council, who we have done webinars with, and regularly advises governments on immigration and investment migration programs. He is joined by two FPP professionals. One is Sonia Clark, who is our regional director for FPP, and she has more than 28 years of executive leadership experience across finance, real estate, investment, logistics, and international business. He specializes in helping investors navigate the EB5 process while building strong relationships with clients and partners around the world. She is joined by Manuel Ortiz, who is our Vice President of Global Business Development for FPP. With more than 20 years of experience in finance and investor relations, he has led capital raising efforts that exceed 500 million from investors in more than 40 countries. Manuel is a frequent speaker on the EB5 program and has a unique EB5 take as his family came across the pond from Spain. He has a very interesting story that I'll let him tell a little later. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and I will let them take it away.
Thank you, Peter. I would just like to welcome everyone as well to today's roundtable. Thank you for the warm welcome. I'd like to also welcome and thank Chris Willis from Latitude. Thank you so much for being our esteemed guest today. It's an absolute honor to actually be sitting on a conversational platform with you, and I think it's a little bit long overdue because of your expertise in the global migration space. Basically, today we are going to be focusing on the current EB5 landscape and global investment migration trends. And today we're going to be bridging the gap between US-specific solutions like the EB5 program and the broader global residency and citizenship trends we are seeing for 2026. So if I can ask, set the stage for Manuel and Chris to have a discussion on looking at the entire global map of investment migration right now, and what are the macro sentiments among the high net worth individuals? Are there people looking at a safe haven or global mobility or just a functional backup plan? If I can maybe pass it to Chris and then we can go to Manuel.
Thanks, Anya and Manuel and Peter. Thanks to FPP for having me on. But yeah, no, great question to start it off. I mean, right now, the world is pretty volatile, and people are the key word we're using a lot now is optionality. So people are saying, look, what is it I need? What's going to be important for me and my family going forward in this age of volatility and uncertainty. And so investors are always, the word obviously investors don't like is volatility or uncertainties and such. So they're looking, where can I make an investment in exchange for residency and citizenship status? Because what we're seeing now is having a second residence or citizenship, it has been commoditized, let's not move away from that. But it does show that people are including this now as a key element of their overall structuring and planning. So it's no longer just about, buying property and having insurances and all this, but it's almost become now a non-traditional insurance policy that people have to make sure they have a second option should they need it. And we'll talk about some reasons why further in the discussion. But I think right now, the other important thing is the market has shifted away from traditional source markets and destinations, which I think we're going to talk about later on as well. But I think it's a real interesting time in our industry. The US is always going to attract people, no matter what, because of what it is being the United States. But now people are looking, should I complement this with something else? Is, residency status good enough, or do I need to essentially upgrade to a citizenship, which then affords me a passport as well as a privilege of being a citizen? Or, do I do a combo of both? So conversations that we're having are quite fascinating in terms of why people are looking at this. But then you also have to factor in what are their motivations, what's their time scale, what's their budget, et cetera, et cetera. So everything is very, very individual, for the person looking at this. But I think that, the US, as I mentioned, is always going to have a very important place in this conversation.
And I would just add to that as well. One of the trends that we're seeing right now is that there's much more of an emphasis on becoming a global citizen, right? At FPP, we only do EB5, but there is a big driver in that, and you're starting to see that more. I would say for the US purposes in the EB5 program, the American dream is alive and well. When you start looking at wage growth, salaries, opportunity for the future, access to capital markets, that's something that is still there. All you have to do is just look at salaries of a doctor or a lawyer in another country and compare them to where they are in the US. And so I think there's still a big driving factor. And the last thing that I'll say is that no matter where you are, I would say that one of the common denominators across multiple countries is a lot of doing it for the kids, right? So kids can study somewhere else, access to better education, access to a better future. Oftentimes people make these migration decisions only thinking about one step forward. So this is for me, or this is for my child. But you don't realize that those decisions can have an impact for generations to come, right? If my grandfather wouldn't have decided to come to the US, I may not even be here because my dad and my mom would have never met. My dad may have never existed. So there's a whole lot of things that go into play here. And I think it's just important to always have that long-term view. And it doesn't mean that you have to stay there, but it at least gives you the option and it empowers you to choose.
Yeah, I'll follow up on that. I mean, a phrase I often use, which can sound a bit cheesy, but it's better to have it and not need it than need it and not have it, right? So as you say, it's kind of tucked in the back pocket, and you know that it's there, and you have that peace of mind knowing that if you had to go somewhere at short notice potentially, that you've got the status to do so. I mean, there was many examples during COVID, for example, where people wanted to leave and go somewhere else, but in many countries, especially in the Caribbean or small islands, they shut their borders unless you were a citizen. We even saw that in New Zealand, we saw it in Australia, where they're very, very conscious of, who's coming in and who could be, a potential national security risk in terms of health. So, but the privilege of being a citizen is you're afforded the protections of the states and everything like that. So for that reason, it's very important that having that extra access is available to you should you need it.
Absolutely, Chris. And then I just want to roll into the evolution of the Plan B into a primary Plan A. For many families, due to the shifting global, the politics and also the tax environment. So I wonder if you can just touch on that a bit for us, please, before we move on to the next segment.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the whole Plan B concept, it sort of originated from countries where they had very weak visa-free travel. So mobility was the initial driver. I'll not picking on you, but I'll look at South Africa as an example. The passport itself is relatively weak in terms of global access. Things like getting access to Europe, to the United Kingdom, to UAE, to Singapore, places like that. And so for people who are saying, look, I'm a global citizen, I'm an international person, I don't want to have my passport tied up at embassies, waiting for visas. I can't be spontaneous with my travel or a business opportunity. And so people coming from countries, I mean, a good example is Pakistan. You can go to Pakistan, you can go to 39 countries visa free, right? So suddenly they get a citizenship in the Caribbean that now jumps to 150 odd, right? So for them, that can be quite significant. And this is, I'm just using a few countries as examples, but Nigeria, is another good one where, these are markets that have evolved because mobility is a primary driver. But nowadays, that's not necessarily the case. I mean, we've seen an enormous increase in the United States of outbound migration. So Americans or people living in the US on a green card who is saying, look, I need to have another option for whatever reasons that are important to me. And so the primary push for the plan B was the just in case, having the mobility, perhaps it's education, that type of thing. But we're also seeing more, not just US bound, but to other countries, the plan A, where they're saying, actually, you know what, I actually want to go and live in Portugal, I actually want to go live in New Zealand, or I want to go live in Panama because I like the lifestyle that's afforded to me. And it's slightly different to what I'm experiencing here in my own country. And I'll give you another quick example on that, which is where we're seeing a lot from the LGBTQ community, where they're feeling pressured in some parts of the world, and they're saying, well, maybe I'm going to move to somewhere that's maybe a little bit more accepting, a little bit more tolerant, and I can live the life that I want to live and not feel pressured or discriminated against in my home country. So it goes back to my earlier point. The motivations of the client are critical. It's understanding why do they want to do this, and then we can help them determine which jurisdiction would be the best fit.
100%. And then just to get on the last point, the taxation, what's happening globally with the taxation, how are you seeing, in investment migration moving? In which direction, in your opinion, is it moving because of certain jurisdictions? If you could just highlight some of them for me, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, I mean, for full disclaimer, I'm not a tax guy. I'm an immigration guy.
Yep.
So this is just sort of 30,000 industry level stuff. But, in most cases, with the exception of the US and, where you have your citizenship-based taxation model, most people are taxed on their domicile. So where are they spending the majority of their time, and where do they have the largest footprint? So, it's usually somewhere between a 90 to 183-day model in terms of where people are determined to be tax resident. So some people look at this as an option. In the UK right now, there's a lot of push of taxes going up. Obviously, there's I'll emphasize another change of government, in the United Kingdom. And so people are getting concerned, especially when they're looking at increases of capital gains tax to mirror income tax and all that type of thing. So people are saying, well, is it going to be better for me tax-wise to move to another country? And you may also have clients who were getting ready for a liquidity event in 3 to 5 years, and they say, well, part of my structuring, let me get set up elsewhere so that I can maybe minimize my tax exposure when I leave my home jurisdiction. So it's becoming more of a conversation. In my world, tax isn't always the primary driver, that they're looking at, but it is definitely a consideration. And of course, we encourage everybody to take, proper fiscal advice, not only in their home country, but in their destination country, to make sure that they're properly structuring things and not having any surprises once they've actually made a move.
Yes, 100%. We're actually busy with an EB5 investor, and that's his primary concern. So he's got to get all his affairs in order before he can proceed. So it's very important you look at those things as one of your serious conversations. And then, Manuel, I just want to turn to you. If maybe you can just go through the Reform and Integrity Act and how it's changed the EB5 landscape, and just priority processing and avoiding backlogs. If you can tell us more about that, please.
Sure. So oftentimes when people think of EB5, they think of a program that was created in the 1990s, but it didn't get popular until about 2008 and 2009. The investment amount up until 2022 was always $500,000. The reason it got popular in 2008, 2009 was because of the financial crisis, and really developers needed access to capital. And so foreign capital was a way to get projects moving, create jobs. And so that was really important for the US government at that time when the capital markets were virtually frozen. But being that the program was created in 1990, it never really evolved. Demand got so high that there was capital, but on the processing side for immigration purposes, delays started to happen because demand was so high. And so you started seeing applications, and I won't get into the weeds about this, but you started seeing applications, for example, the first application called the 526, where the government verifies the source of funds, was taking 15 years in some cases. And so that virtually stopped the program, stopped foreign capital coming in from EB5 from specific countries. And so we really needed a EB5 2.0, which is what the RIA was. And I'll mention our founder, Bob Kraft, was president of IUSA, which is the National Trade Organization of EB5, 6 different terms. And he was actually president in 2022 when the RIA was actually formed. So we were in a leadership position at that time and were instrumental in the drafting and creating of the program with what we have now. And what do we have now? That same application that I said used to take 15 years is now taking anywhere from 3 to 8 months. Um, People that were getting green cards in 15 to 20 years or something crazy like that. We've had some examples here over the course of the last year and a half where, some investors were getting their green cards in 8 months. So from a processing standpoint, there's been a lot of speed, specifically for rural projects, which do get priority processing. A rural project is just a project that's located in the area with a population under 20,000. Right. So that's been the major focus on EB5. It's gotten better. It has gotten a little bit more expensive. But if you think about it, $500,000 to $800,000. That $500,000 was 1990 money. If you adjust that to inflation to where it is today, it's still a deal. Right. And so I think that's a really important thing to consider as, people think about EB5, where it is, where it's going. And one last thing that I'll mention is that the RIA that you mentioned, which is the Reform and Integrity Act, it actually added additional protections to investors as to how funds are actually used, monitoring of fund use. And so it's a better program from a processing standpoint. It's a better program from the controls in place to protect investors. And by the way, also another positive thing that isn't talked about enough is a lot of the bad actors from the past got shook out of the industry. And so I think that's a really good thing. We're in a much better place. And we're looking forward to September of 2027 when we look for the program to be reauthorized again.
100%, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that later. I'm saving a little piece towards the end. But so, Chris, I just wanted to ask you from your global vantage point, is the EB5 visa program still perceived a good option, like a crown jewel, compared to some of the other programs, European programs?
Yeah, well, I think, Manuel touched on it. It's still a deal, right? When you look at it in the global context. And of course, it's giving you access to the United States, which, he touched on earlier as well. And so it's always going to have that place. And again, we hope that it's going to continue, even though there was, the new gold card that Trump put out, which, were people worrying, is this going to be a competition to EB5? It doesn't look like it will, which is great, because I think the EB5 is a phenomenal program. And it's making sure that, whoops, something fell in the background, sorry. So I need to make sure that people who are understanding the need to apply to the United States are seeing, is this the right solution for me, for my family? But in the global context, people may say, well, look, yeah, the US is great, or perhaps they have some reasons why they don't want to go to the US, but they still have to drive to leave their existing country. So they say, where do I go? And so many people, as I mentioned, we have a lot of people currently in the US who are looking for outbound options, but many people in general are just looking for an option somewhere, in the world. So places like Europe continue to be popular. Panama I touched on, New Zealand, and we have a really exciting program coming out in Argentina, later this year. So, there's a lot of demand. The US, just by nature of what it is as a country, is always going to attract people. Even in the UK, I sort of joked about the government there, but the UK is still going to attract people because London's London, New York's New York, that type of thing. That's not going to change. But people, again, I keep going back to, it depends on the individual needs of the person, what's their main driver, and then what's going to be the best solution. Because for one client, the US could be the best fit. For another, it could be Portugal. But that's part of the process we have to go through to figure out.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for your insight. And Emmanuel, I think one thing that we just need to touch on is the concurrent filing under the new rules on EB5. I think that's a huge advantage under the new Reform and Integrity Act. I don't know if you just want to mention a little bit about that, and then we can move on to the next one.
Sure. And just really quickly, under the previous program, what would end up happening is if you apply for EB5 when you're here, you just have to wait to go through the normal approval process, get permission to work and travel, much until you really got the green card. There was no adjustment period. And so sometimes that process, like I mentioned, could take years, and you'd lose your status under your current visa, which was very problematic. Under the RIA, what you have now is the concept of an adjustment of status. So the biggest example that is the most popular right now is the person that's here on an H-1B or a student. So what would happen on an H-1B, right? You're sponsored by your employer and you're basically locked in. What EB-5 actually gives you the ability to do now with the adjustment of status is, say you apply for EB-5, you can actually adjust your status and get permission to work and travel, which is something that wasn't available before. And it's something that does speed up the process for people that are already here. And again, this is kind of something that you would have to check with immigration attorneys because there are certain visas that would not qualify for that. For example, if you're a tourist, that's not going to count. But again, it is a big advantage for people that are here on an H-1B or perhaps even on a student visa.
Thanks, Manuel. And then to Chris, yeah, just looking at the trends again, are you seeing a shift in who is actually applying? Just a demographic, sort of landscape of things. And then also how the definitions of a retirement destination has also changed.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what we're seeing is, I touched on it earlier, the United States has become a very significant source market, where previously it was a destination market for things like EB-5. And so, starting from, I mean, this is going back probably 6 or 8 years when it really started to become significant. What really kicked a lot of things off was during COVID. You remember there was a short period of time when there was a travel ban for American citizens. You couldn't go to Europe, you couldn't go to certain parts of the world. And so that exposed a lot of high net worth and ultra high net worth families who said, well, how do I find a solution if something like this would happen again? And so then they started exploring the need for a second residence or citizenship because, American, you can hop on a plane and go pretty well anywhere in the world. You don't think about it, right? But suddenly they had to think about it and realize, okay, we need to have a solution here. So, that market has changed. You still have the traditional source markets of China, Asia, Middle East, Africa, etc. We see a little bit out of Latin America, but that's let's say still an evolving market. I know certainly coming inbound to the US under EB-5, you have strong markets there, but for the other jurisdictions, maybe less so. But one of the interesting things is, New Zealand put out a program a year ago in April, and that brought a lot of interest from the West Coast of the United States in particular. About half of the applications globally come from the United States. So I thought that was a very interesting shift of, why New Zealand and why everybody coming from the United States. But one thing New Zealand did that was very interesting was they created, it was permanent residency for life. So unlike, say, if you're on a green card and you got to maintain day counts every 5-year cycle to maintain your status, you don't have to do that in New Zealand. Once you've done an initial 21 days in the first 3 years, then you've got residency for life. So it kind of sits a little bit above residency, but a little bit below citizenship, right? But they were very clever how they designed that to make sure that it sort of fit that niche for people who are happy enough with that. They can manage without the passport, but they wanted the status without spending the time. So, those types of shifts are quite interesting. You've also got, places like Malta in Europe, which has evolved to what's called a citizenship by merit program. And so people need to be deemed meritorious enough to be able to qualify. And, you're putting money into projects that are of national importance to the country. But what it's giving you, of course, is access to the European Union. And this is where a lot of people like the sort of 1 = 27 concept. So, having those settlement rights, maybe you apply and you become a citizen of Malta, but you end up, settling in Portugal or Ireland or in Scandinavia, wherever is important for you as a family. And this touches on Manuel's earlier point about the succession planning. What about the kids? Suddenly you're able to give to your kids, full European Union settlement rights. That's quite the gift, right? And for people who have not had the ability to appreciate that, it's when your kids get older and they see, wow, this is great. I can actually do this. And so the markets I think will maintain steady, in terms of main source areas. But for us, the biggest increase has been out of the United States, both citizens and green card holders.
Okay, and then Manuel, then we get to the green card and the investment topic. How important is the structure and the track record And investors need to ensure that their capital is safe and their green card is secure. So maybe if we can just go into detail a little bit there on FPP and what we've done for investors.
Sure. So FEP has been around since 2008. We've had multiple projects that have returned investor capital. We have a 100% approval record and investors obtaining their permanent green card. But what I would say, it's really important to focus on track record up to a certain point, right? Because it doesn't do you any good that we did great in a project in California 15 years ago where the macroeconomic factors were completely different. The sub-market factors were different. We were in a completely different interest rate market. The strategy for that specific project was different. So I think oftentimes people focus on track record, but really all it tells you is that we do the right thing and we know how to do it. It doesn't speak specifically to that individual investment that you're looking at today, right? Or that specific structure. When you're looking at structure, I'll also say that it's really important just from an educational standpoint is that EB5 projects can vary, right? When you think of the capital stack, let's say a project costs $20 million. You could be a senior loan, you could be a mezzanine loan, you could be equity. EB5 is an economic tool that can fall in anywhere in the capital stack, play any position, very flexible. That's a really good thing. But as investors are making their investment decisions, it's always very important to think about how am I going to be the most protected? Typically, when you look at the capital stack, the senior loan position is going to be the priority of repayment. That is great. But I would say that just because you're in a senior position doesn't mean that it's a great investment. There are many senior loan projects that have failed in the past. And that doesn't mean that mezzanine options are bad, or even on the equity side, if you have a higher appetite for risk. Right, so it's just very important to analyze deals on the fundamental merit of that particular business thesis, and also just the structure and the protections to investors. And it's important as investors think about protections to think about it in two ways. When investors are just looking at an investment, no migration benefit, you're just looking at getting your capital back and getting a specific return. But when investors are evaluating EB5 projects, it's important to look at it from two different standpoints. From one standpoint is the investment. That's how you get your money back. On the other side, what are the immigration protections there for investors? Because that's what gets you your green card. So an EB5 investor's job is a lot harder than just your traditional investor with a non-migration benefit, because you have to be right on two different things, and they're so different from each other that you really have to conduct your due diligence with really unbiased sources. Broker dealers are a great option. Immigration attorneys are great for the immigration side of things, but you have to be right on both.
Thank you. You answered my next 2 or 3 questions anyway. So that was a great ending. Thank you very much. And Chris, any last thoughts from your side?
No, I think like most things, it's do your research, see which jurisdiction is going to be the best fit, because ultimately you're putting money and time and energy into this process, and you want to make sure it's going to be the right solution for you and your family.
Absolutely. And Manuel, any last thoughts?
I would say just one last thing. It's very important to think of EB5 as a long-term proposition. And so because it's long-term, it's a long-term relationship, and really look behind the project, the presentation, and look at the people that you're going to be working with for an extended period of time. In any migration platform, especially with Chris and with Latitude, the people behind the operation make a huge difference, because we expect for things to go great. But in the event that they don't, you do want to be working with a highly competent team, but also just good people. That's a really important part of it.
Absolutely. Yeah. And due diligence, one of the most important parts. That's why we only showcase the best. So thank you very much, Chris. Thank you very much, Manuel. We will be sending out some slides, and please reach out to us. Peter will also display the contact details at the end of this. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.